It's time to change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
So last week, one of the promises made to David was that God was going to secure Israel's border under David's reign, where that promise was given to David in the same message from Nathan the prophet, where God said he would build David a house. And this week, we see God's promise of Israel's security being fulfilled, where King Saul, he had fought many of these same enemies. And the first thing that we see is David is attacking the Philistines, where it always used to be the Philistines were attacking Israel, where the Philistines gathered all these innumerable armies, and they always outnumbered Israel. And we saw that twice with Saul, and then with David, we also saw it twice after David had conquered Jerusalem. But now, after this battle, the Philistines are subdued, where the Philistines will never be able to recover and to become a serious threat to Israel ever again. And then it says that David took Metheg Ammah from the hand of the Philistines. And Metheg Ammah means bridle of the mother city, which is just another name for the city of Gath, where David had spent almost a year and a half with King Achish. And by taking the bridle, this means that David has gained control of the city, where now even the Philistines are under submission to David. And then in verse 2, we see that David defeated Moab. And here it says he forced the Moabite soldiers to lie down on the ground, where he divided them into 3 lines. And then it says he killed the men in 2 of the lines, allowing only 1 line to live. So David here, he kills 2/3 of the Moabite army, sparing only 1/3 of their men. So now the Moabites, they're subject to David. And so it says they're going to pay them tribute. And to pay tribute means that they're going to pay taxes. And you kind of wonder here, you think, well, what happened? Didn't David have a relationship with the king of Moab? Weren't they friends? Because if you remember, David had taken his aged parents to the king of Moab, where the Moabite king, he offered to take care of them while David was fleeing from Saul. But in the Jewish Midrash, which is an ancient Hebrew rabbinical interpretation of the Talmud, it says that when David became the king of Judah, that the king of Moab put David's parents to death. And we don't know if that's true, but it's possible, and that's what the Midrash says. But by allowing 1/3 of the soldiers to live, that was a lot more generous and much more mercy than a lot of the other kings would have shown during the same time period. And then we read that David also defeated Hadaezer, the king of Zobah. Zobah was a Syrian city, or a Aramean city-state that was located northeast of Israel and north of Damascus. Because basically, Syria was divided by these 2 major groups, those from the city of Zobah and those from the city of Damascus. And so after this defeat, David, he gained control of the whole territory. And it says he gained it all the way to the Euphrates River, which you have to remember, that was actually a promise that was given way back to Father Abraham, the patriarch. So now David, he's not only recaptured all the territory that was lost during King Saul's reign, but he has also expanded Israel's border, acquiring land that was promised that hadn't been conquered during Joshua's day. And with all these victories, David, he establishes treaties with all these countries, making them all subject to Israel. Where now David, he's setting up garrisons, which means he's setting up weapons with men in all of their territories to be able to maintain Israel's authority. And so conquering Zobah, David, he didn't only end up taking all their soldiers and horsemen and all the chariots, but he also ends up with all their horses. And David, he can't take care of all of these horses while on a military campaign, and he can't give them back to the enemies. And he's not going to take them home and multiply horses in disobedience to God. So what David does is he hamstrung all the horses, which means they cut a tendon in the horse's leg, so the horses can't run anymore. So the horses are no longer any good for battle, but they can still pull a plow. And David, he only keeps a minimum of horses for 100 chariots. And then we're told the other Syrians from Damascus, because these groups, they would band together in a confederation because they're all Syrians for fighting a common enemy. And so they tried to come to Hadaezer's rescue, where David, he killed 22,000 of them and put them under tribute. And then he put garrisons in Damascus, which also gave David control over all of the major trade routes. So how it was is you either served David and became his servant and paid him tribute, or else you were killed. And what this meant peace for Israel, where now they can finally live normal lives instead of being constantly threatened by all their neighbors like it had always been. And these victories, they also brought a lot of wealth to Israel, where here we see that David, he took Hadaezer's gold shields, which would have been his public displays of his great wealth. And David, he also took all his bronze. And with all this wealth and it all being dedicated to the Lord, because it's being dedicated for the building of God's temple, which is the temple that David is not allowed to build. But besides making enemies, David is also making some friends. He's making friends with all the lesser kings, like Toi, where Hadaezer had also been his enemy. So all of these kings, they're more than willing to pay David tribute. They like having a treaty with David, and they like how David is the new boss in their region, where David now, he's bringing stability to this whole region of the world. So David has now subdued all the nations from way up in the north, up in Syria, all the way down to Moab, to both sides of the Dead Sea, and with everything in between. And then it says here that David, he made himself a name, killing 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. But in the old manuscripts, it calls these people Edomites, and that's who they probably were, because the Hebrew word for Syrian and Edomite is only the difference of a character. So it's just one letter different. And the Valley of Salt is by the Dead Sea. That is in Edom's area. And then right after you read that, it tells you that the Edomites, they became David's servants. So God's promise of securing his people Israel has been fulfilled, and it's almost fulfilled immediately since God had promised it. And then we get down to verse 15, and we're given David's administration, where we know Joab, David's nephew, from David's half-sister Zeruiah, who was the commander over his army. And then you have Jehoshaphat, who is the recorder, which means he's the keeper of the court records. So he's an administrator, but this is not Jumpin' Jehoshaphat, not the one that Yosemite Sam from Bugs Bunny is always shouting about. This is not the Jehoshaphat that's descended from King David. But then in David's administration, he also had Zadok and Ahimelech as priests. And Zadok, he was descended from Eleazar's line, which is considered the good line, where his followers will eventually be called the Zadokites, who will later be known as the Sadducees during Jesus' time. And then Ahimelech, he's descended from Eli's line, where this Elimelech is the son of Abiathar, who was that priest who was with David in the wilderness that had the ephod that sought God for David. Where apparently Abiathar, he named his son after his father Elimelech, who was murdered, if you remember, by Doeg the Edomite at King Saul's command. And then we have Sariah the scribe, and then we have Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, who's over the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And nobody is absolutely certain who the Cherethites and the Pelethites were, but it's believed they were foreign-born bodyguards, kind of like a special forces unit. And they think they came from Crete and possibly some of them from Philistia, which means they came from the Philistines, but these were very loyal Philistines to David. And Benaniah, their boss here, he was really quite a guy, because you can read about him in 1 Chronicles in chapter 22, where he's listed as one of David's mighty men. And we're told there that he's very valiant and that he killed 2 lion-like men of Moab. But then he also killed a real lion on a snowy day inside of a pit. And then he wrestled an 8-foot Egyptian man, killed him with his own spear after he wrestled it out of his hands. But on top of all of that, Benaniah was a priest. And so who would think he'd also be a priest? And you read that in 1 Chronicles 27:5. And you never hear of very many priests who become warriors. So this is a very special man. And Benaniah, he'll be around for a long time because he's also going to serve King David's son Solomon during his reign. And then David, he had jobs for all of his sons, where here it calls them chief ministers, but the actual word that it uses here is literally priests. But they're not priests in the sense of the priesthood. And it's likely that they're David's consultants to keep the priesthood and the kingdom in line with each other. And so now we get to chapter 9. And in chapter 9, we really get to see what kind of man David really is, where you have this king who has to be the busiest man in Jerusalem, who already has way too much on his plate running the kingdom. And where last week we saw this David, he asked, "What can I do for God?" Where David desired to build a temple for God. And now this week, we see David asking, "What can I do for others?" And out of all the people in the world, who does he want to do something for? He wants to do something kind for Saul, or he wants to do something kind for King Saul's descendants. And that's because of his love for his friend Jonathan. And Saul and Jonathan, they've been dead for about 16 years now, and David has still not forgotten his friend or his commitment to Jonathan. But David, he doesn't know who's left from Saul's family. And you would kind of think, well, couldn't he just go ask his wife, Michal? But he doesn't, and I just figure they're probably still not talking. But the truth is, she probably doesn't know. But then David, he finds out about Ziba, who's the head servant of Saul's house. And so David, he calls Ziba to come to him. And I don't know why, but when I picture Ziba, I think of him being like Dobby from the Harry Potter movies, where Dobby wouldn't do anything against Harry Potter, and with his big eyes, and where he acts really humble and polite because he's a servant, because he has to, but he doesn't really like being a servant. And underneath it all, he has his own agenda, because Ziba, underneath the surface, he's trying to build his own house, because we find out that he has 15 sons and 20 servants of his own. So Ziba, he would rather be a master than the servant. But before King David, he'll always say and do the right things. And so they have this conversation, and David says, "Are you Ziba?" And just like Batman's butler Alfred, he says, "At your service, Master Bruce." But he doesn't say Master Bruce. And then David asks, and he says, "Is there not someone from the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness to?" And the only reason that Ziba would be the only one who knew if Saul had any descendants left is because he was Saul's head servant. Because Mephibosheth, he's in hiding. And the reason that Mephibosheth is hiding is because it's customary for the new king to kill everyone from the former king's household and not to leave any heirs to the throne of the old king's dynasty. So here we have the most powerful man in Israel, if not the whole world, King David, and we see him do something that he never had to do. He's going to show kindness. something that very few powerful men ever do. But it's something they should do, to show kindness to strangers, to the misfortunate. And so here, David, he's going to go out of his way, and it's not to show kindness just to someone from his own family. And you have to realize, David, he has a large family because he has multiple wives. So that means he has their family. So he's got dozens of mother-in-laws and dozens of father-in-laws and brother-in-laws. He has dozens of children who could all benefit from his kindness. And I'm sure they were all recipients of his kindness. But here he's looking for someone to show God's kindness to. And so he goes out of his way. And it's not necessarily to find a friend, because David, he's asking here if there's anyone from Saul's household, someone from the household of the man who chased him for 10 years and tried to have him put to death. Because right here, it doesn't seem that David, he even knew that Jonathan ever had a son. So David, he's just looking for anyone from Saul's household to show kindness to. And if you look at the phrase that David used, he says, to whom I may show the kindness of God. And so this is not David's own kindness he's trying to show, but this is the same kind of kindness that God has shown to David. And now he wants to show that kind of kindness to someone from Saul's house. And Ziba tells David, there is someone, and it happens to be his best friend, Jonathan's son, who's lame in both his feet. So this is the same one that we read about earlier at the time of Ishbosheth's murder. And if you remember, he's the son of Saul that Abner made king. And if you remember, it was kind of odd how they were telling that story of Ishbosheth, and then Mephibosheth is mentioned right in the middle of Ishbosheth's story. But the reason that Mephibosheth was mentioned back then is because he's the last living heir of Saul, who just happens to be Jonathan's son, the one who became crippled in both of his feet when dropped by his nurse when fleeing after the death of Saul and Jonathan by the Philistines. Where the person that he would have been fleeing from would have been the new royal leader. He would be fleeing from the king that was to replace Saul. Because whoever that king was to be, they would be more than likely to execute any potential heir to the throne from Saul's dynasty, because that's what every king would do. And Jonathan, he was supposed to be the heir to Saul's throne, and Mephibosheth is his only son. So Mephibosheth is the firstborn son of the firstborn son of King Saul. And all the other rivals to the throne, they're now all dead. So Mephibosheth, he was hiding for his life. And that's why Ziba, Saul's servant, is the only one who knows where Mephibosheth is. And the only person Mephibosheth has been hiding from is King David, especially if he ever believed any of the things that his grandfather, King Saul, said about David. Where Saul, he said it was David who was the one who was going to try to seek his life and all the lives of all the royal family. He was always accusing David of trying to take the throne. And so it's very possible that Mephibosheth has feared and hated David from his very early childhood, where he may have blamed David for losing everything, for losing the throne and the land, and maybe even for having these crippled feet. Because if there was no David, they wouldn't have had to flee for their lives. But here, it really appears that David, that he never knew that his best friend Jonathan ever had a son. And so David, he sends for Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, he's now about 21 years old, and he's really not doing that well. Because David finds Mephibosheth living in a low place where he's not even living in his own home, where he's hiding for his life, staying at another man's house, the house of Machir in Lo-debar. And Lo-debar is very far from Jerusalem. It's on the east side of the Jordan River in Gilead. And Lo-debar, what it means, it literally means no pasture, which means this is a desolate place in the middle of nowhere. So he's a real nowhere man sitting in his nowhere land, making all his nowhere plans for nobody. That's Mephibosheth. And then that day comes that Mephibosheth feared his whole life. And David's messengers, they showed up at the door, and they're going to take him to David, to this man he hated his whole life. The one Mephibosheth may have believed killed his uncle Ishbosheth, because it was Ishbosheth's captains that actually killed his uncle, but they were thinking they were doing David a favor, because there were a lot of people who probably thought that way about David, because we'll see it later that he'll always be accused of taking Saul's throne by bloodshed. And here, there's nothing Mephibosheth can do, because he can't run. In fact, because he's crippled, they're going to have to carry him to David. And so this whole trip, he may have been thinking, I'm a dead man. And so they brought him before David. And Mephibosheth, he falls on his face before David, and he's laying prostrate, which would be very difficult for him to do because his legs are crippled. And he's laying there, not knowing what to expect, laying in a position as if he's begging for mercy. And the very first thing that David does is he puts this poor man at ease. And you have to realize that nothing that David says here to Mephibosheth is because he's crippled. Where none of this is out of pity for Mephibosheth being handicapped. Where everything that's being said, that David says, is just out of his desire to show kindness. It has nothing to do with Mephibosheth. It all has to do with David's heart of who he is, because David is like Jesus Christ here. Because it's David who sought out Mephibosheth, and he sought him out to show him God's kindness. And it's not because of who Mephibosheth is or because he deserved it, because he didn't. David didn't even know he existed. And David, he did all of this while he was being mischaracterized by Mephibosheth, where David was hated and treated as an enemy. But David did it all out of his own love for his father, Jonathan, not for Mephibosheth. And this is the same for us. Jesus loved us while we were yet sinners, when we were the enemies of God, and where it was Jesus who sought us. And it wasn't because we're all so lovable, but it was because of his love for the Father, like in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. Where Jesus, he isn't just the most powerful king in the world, but of the universe. And so David, he says to Mephibosheth, do not fear, for I will surely show you the kindness for Jonathan your father's sake, and will restore to you all the land of Saul, your grandfather. So here, Mephibosheth, he hears something that he's never known before, where he finds out that everything that he's ever believed about David was a lie.
To let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,